Ancient Near East. Michael earned an MA and PhD in Hebrew, Bible, and Semitic languages from the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Before attending UW-Madison, Mike earned an MA in Ancient History from the University of Pennsylvania, where his major fields were ancient Israel and Egyptology. Mike has more than a dozen years of classroom teaching experience in the college level, 10 years of online teaching at the seminary level as well. He's currently a scholar in residence with the Logos Biblical Software and, of course, noted author, including, of course, the latest called Reversing Hermon. And Michael, I'm going to have you describe that title to a lot of people, okay?
Sure, yeah. Thanks for having me back, George.
Sure, good to have you. What does the title mean, Reversing Hermon?
Yeah, Hermon is a reference to Mount Hermon, which is north of the Holy Land, north of Israel. And according to the book of Enoch, this was the place where the Watchers, that's Enoch's terminology for the sons of God from Genesis 6, part of the flood story, the beginning of the flood story. This is the mountain from which they descended to collude together they made a pact together to essentially, help humanity to destroy itself. And I was listening to the talk with Gerald Salenti on the previous hour. They, just lamenting the condition of people, life, just our times. And I just couldn't help, be drawn again, back to this story. Humans can do just fine to destroy themselves, but again, in the biblical account and books like Enoch, they had some help. They were again nudged in directions, to exploit technology, relationships, and turn all that stuff into violence and self-destruction. And that's really what the Enochian story is about. And Mount Hermon is the place that the ancients thought, hey, this is where it all got started.
You have studied this for some time now, and as we get into this, there's some really poignant parts about it and some scary things about this too, Mike. Mm-hmm. Are we going to be okay as a people? Because I'm not sure.
Yeah, on one hand, you look at you look at what's happening in the world, and I'm thinking of the way things are trending. And, you look at that, you look at the Bible, and the Bible's not the only text that sort of points this direction, but the Bible has such a prominent role, in our culture that's the one that people, look at so often. And you could look at everything and say, well, this is kind of supposed to be happening, just trending in the negative, toward self-destruction, again, toward, really chaotic upheaval, on a global scale. But on the other hand, it never, at least the Bible never leaves us without, a hope, the activity of God to try to thwart all this. And of course, God uses people, and, people can, withstand evil. They can, oppose evil, on all sorts of levels and in all sorts of ways. And so, you have this conflict among, human populations, and the Bible always sort of, turns the page on that and says, well, behind all that, there's really something going on in the unseen world that is, fueling all this, what is loosely referred to as spiritual warfare, that the Bible always casts as being connected to what's going on earth. So it's a battle. The story's not written yet, but, things are supposed to trend this way. And, there's an ebb and flow to all of it that, of course, factors into, prophetic outlook when it comes to, to works like the Bible.
Michael, let's describe Enoch. Of course, he was the father of Methuselah, who lived 900 some years. I want to get into that in a second. Mm-hmm. He was the great-grandfather of Noah as well. But the book of Enoch is what?
Yeah, the book of Enoch is actually really a compilation, an assemblage of several books. If you look at it as a whole, it's got 108 chapters, and those chapters, again, scholars have, I think for good reason, determined that, the original composition wasn't all 108 chapters. There was a core of it, and then it gets added to as time goes on. But the material itself is pretty ancient. In terms of manuscript evidence that we have, it goes all the way back into 2nd century BC, maybe even earlier than that. There are fragments of it found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. And, again, it has a long history. It informed biblical thinking. New Testament writers had read this book. And that's really what my book, Reversing Hermon, is about. I really want to try to get people to appreciate the role that the Book of Enoch played in the thinking of those who wrote the New Testament. They were very familiar with this book, and they assumed their audience would be familiar with it too. And so they just drop words and phrases and scenes and different things into their own material, the books of the New Testament that people probably know a little bit more readily. But a lot of that stuff, if you had the Book of Enoch in your head, you would be just picking up, lots of things that are telegraphed that would help you be a more intelligent reader of the New Testament. So it was a really important book.
Michael, the Bible says that Enoch lived 365 years before he was taken by God. This taken sounds almost like an extraterrestrial abduction case, doesn't it?
Yeah, people always bring that up. They'll reference language like that. We're actually not given any specifics. It actually says Enoch walked with God and was not. Essentially, like he was gone.
He was gone. Poof.
Poof. Was no more. But there are no details actually given to it. And we actually see, mostly in the Book of Enoch, but there are other places where, Enoch is still in the picture. So you kind of get an idea of what he's doing, and he's interacting with members of the spiritual world, and so he's not like gone, but he's out of the picture as far as his human relationships, human existence, and that sort of thing. So on one hand, yeah, the account sort of lends itself to mystery, but on the other hand, there's a lot actually said about Enoch and the role he plays, really as an intercessor between God and, again, to use his terminology, the Watchers, who rebel against God and try to corrupt humanity.
Are the Watchers demons, the devil, who fallen angels? Who are they?
Yeah, that's really a good question because, again, I'm sort of famous or infamous for this, but a lot of what people, especially Christians, who take the Bible seriously, a lot of what they think they know about demonology and angelology is really the product of church tradition and is not the product of the Bible itself. And certainly the Bible read in its own original context, which in the case of the New Testament is, the first century and the few centuries preceding that, and of course the Older Testament. The Watchers are not the demons of the Gospels, and that surprises a lot of people. They're connected to where demons come from, but they're not technically the same. You actually have different groups of bad guys, if I can use sort of that kind of parlance. You have different rebellions. I like to illustrate it this way. If you ask the average Christian, hey, why is the world so messed up? The answer you're going to get is, well, that's the fall. It's Adam and Eve and Satan and the serpent and all that kind of stuff. And again, that's because that's the way we're taught to process that question. If you ask the average first century Jew, someone living in the intertestamental period, who would have been alive at the time of Jesus, if you ask them the same question, that is not the answer you would get. They would say, well, there's actually three reasons why the world is the way it is and just so messed up. There's the fall, the Adam and Eve, the story. But then there's the Genesis 6 story, the Watcher story, the sons of God and the human women. And then there's also what happened at Babel. And in the Jewish mind of antiquity, those things were all connected. It wasn't just one; it was three. And church tradition has more or less squelched the numbers 2 and number 3. I run into believers, people who would call themselves believers, Bible believers, all the time, whether they're just lay folk or scholars, and they really demythologize parts of the Bible, like Genesis 6, and of course the Babel event, and that's too weird, to give any time, any real serious thought to it. But somehow that the Adam and Eve story, the serpent story, that's not weird. And my response to that is, hey, look, it's all strange. You can't really pick and choose here. Do you are you going to embrace? You're going to believe what the biblical writers believed and gave you. in this thing we call the Bible, or are you not?
Were they eyewitnesses, in your opinion?
I think they were eyewitnesses to some things and not other things. And sometimes you can tell that pretty clearly, from from the events themselves. I'll give you an example. I was actually working on an article today about the baptism of Jesus. Well, you take the four gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. None of them are ever described as being at the scene, but they wrote about it, and so there you have an instance where they're not eyewitnesses, but they certainly knew lots of people who were.
Right.
And they get the information, they put it into their gospel, their history of the life of Jesus later on. So sometimes they are, sometimes they're not.
You have discussed the Antichrist. How does that fit into this?
Yeah, reversing Hermon, I actually devote 2 chapters to this. Again, people need to realize, again, what I'm trying to do in the book. I'm trying to, again, get people to read their Bible, in this case the New Testament, the way the writers would have thought about it. I want them to sort of be informed and have the first century person living in their head. And the book of Enoch, again, is very important for New Testament thinking. And believe it or not, the whole notion of an Antichrist actually factors into this. It's going to sound maybe a little bit bizarre to people who might be new to your show. I mean, if you have a situation where people are used to the content of the show, this might not sound so unusual, but some people it might. But something as presumably familiar to us as the Antichrist actually has roots in the book of Enoch, and really the way a first century person would have thought about that figure actually involved Genesis 6, again, the sons of God and the Watchers, and in this case also the Nephilim, the giants. And what I'm trying to do in this book is give people, not my speculation, on these things, but to take peer-reviewed scholarship in the field of New Testament, in the field of ancient Judaism, that I've collected over the years and really have benefited from in terms of research, and make all of that decipherable and show people how scholars have connected these things. And it might sound, again, really strange that a figure like the Antichrist would actually have something to do with events before the flood and events associated with Babylon, but they really do. And it's kind of fascinating, actually.
Who do you think the Antichrist might be?
There's an appendix in my book about this. I personally gravitate toward the view that the Antichrist will not be a Jew. I mean, that there's a difference of opinion there in scholarship, Jew or Gentile, Jew or non-Jew. I think he will be a non-Jewish person, and that's basically because the Old Testament material that factors into this, and yes, I said Old Testament, but when we hear Antichrist, we think of New Testament stuff because of the word Christ. But all the Antichrist is the great end times enemy of the Messiah. And even before the time of Jesus, there were Jews expecting a Messiah, naturally. And so they also had a profile in their heads of what the enemy, who would confront the Messiah would be like, even before Jesus was here, even before there was a church, before there was Christianity. And the way they thought about these things, it had to be a Gentile, because in the book of Daniel, especially chapters 9 through 11, sort of the prototype for the Antichrist was a person named Antiochus IV, also known as Antiochus Epiphanes. And he, in his life, sort of fulfills or aligns with a wide range of things that are said about the Antichrist. And we know that the Antichrist wasn't Antiochus IV because Jesus lived after Antiochus, and Jesus is still talking about a future Antichrist. But he was a Gentile, and he becomes sort of the prototypical reference point for a lot of Antichrist talk. And again, believe it or not, it connects back to Babylon, back to the sons of God, back to the Watchers. And there's just lots of data there that the casual Bible reader, even the Bible student, doesn't really realize is there. And so in Reversing Hermon, again, I'm trying to get this material to people. So if they're interested, there's a lot of ancient material that should factor into the way we think about these things.
With the Antichrist, are we close to end times right now?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think there's any way to predict that. I actually would agree with what Gerald Salente said last hour, that we really can't predict the future. I would say this, though, that there are things. I mean, you can look at certain things on a geopolitical level, on a spiritual level, and you can make statements like, boy, I don't really know what would be missing from the profile. In other words, there are a number of things that we could sort of mentally align with certain biblical statements that, hey, this would fit this thing, this would fit the other thing, this sure looks like this sure looks like that. We're just not given a timeline or any way to know for sure. My view of prophecy, incidentally, and this might be new to a lot of people as well, but a lot of people try to figure out, what's going to happen. I personally believe that prophecy is deliberately cryptic. It's not accidental. And where I get that from is the Apostle Paul in his first letter to the Corinthians. He's talking to them and he says, look, fellows, had the rulers of this world known, and that's a famous Pauline phrase for the powers of darkness, spiritual evil. Had they known what the fallout would have been, they never would have crucified Jesus. In other words, if the powers of darkness had known what was going to happen as a result of the crucifixion, that in biblical thinking that was the key event,
they never would have gone through with it.
Right? Yeah, they're not idiots. They never would have done it had they known this is the key event to sort of undermine them and lead to their own defeat. And so my view of a lot of this stuff is actually, hey, look, the first time around it was deliberately cryptic, again, to hide certain things. God doesn't need to put all his cards on the table, so to speak. And the cryptic part of it was really important so that, again, intelligent evil wouldn't know what was going on. And so my view is, look, why should we expect anything different the second time around? We can get a little glimpse, but even with the first coming, even the first set of circumstances, even the New Testament writers didn't know what was going on until they had hindsight, until everything, played out, and then they could look back and say, oh, now I remember this, I remember Jesus saying that, boy, that makes sense now. One of my favorite examples of this is after the resurrection, they're in the room, the upper room, and the resurrected Christ, appears before them. There, he's standing right in front of them, and they still don't get it.
And Thomas, doubting Thomas, still doesn't get
passage.
It. Right? Yeah.
It says Jesus had to open their minds so that they would understand. And he's standing right there. They still don't get it. Well, it's not because they're dumb. It's because they weren't supposed to know beforehand. It was only after the fact that they could put all the pieces together. And I think that's how prophecy is going to work in the future, too.
The Nephilim, I want to talk with you about that when we come back after the break, Michael. But in your opinion, what were they?
Yeah, I think the Nephilim were, again, I'll use the term giants, unusually tall. I actually don't think that they were, monstrously tall. And that's because of the dimensions that are actually given to us in the Old Testament. We get the dimensions of two of the descendants, and they're roughly 7 feet tall.
Which was tall for those time periods. Let's come back in a moment. Welcome back, Mike Kaiser with us. Mike, you're talking about the Nephilim being about 7 feet tall. Not unusually tall, is it?
No, it's not. There are, again, a couple of giants where we actually get dimensions in the Bible. People might be thinking, well, Goliath, boy, he was like 9 feet, almost 10 feet tall. Actually, according to the Dead Sea Scrolls, those manuscripts of the episode between David and Goliath, they have Goliath at 6.5 feet tall. There's another giant, again, mentioned that's around 7 feet tall. So when you actually get dimensions, they're really not, extraordinary by our standards, but, back in the day, when the average male, again, according to skeletons archaeologists have found, the average male is about, 5'4", 5'5". That's pretty big.
Right.
It would be pretty intimidating, especially if you had, clans or people groups or clusters, of these sorts of people. Again, it's going to be quite intimidating.
Too bad they didn't have basketball leagues in those days. You could have really scooped up with those Nephilim.
Right.
Huh.
Yeah, there you go. There's a franchise.
Where did they come, biblically speaking, where did they come from?
Yeah, the story is, again, foundational to this is Genesis 6, 1 through 4. The sons of God, take human women, and they have offspring that are called the Nephilim. But there's actually two ways, I think, to read this and still sort of honor the supernatural worldview that's involved in this. The first way is sort of the more obvious one, that you have a sexual relationship there, and then you get Nephilim. Now, the Nephilim are called people. They're called men.
Mm-hmm.
And you get very normal terms.
Are they human beings?
Well, according to that terminology, they are. But what's different about them would be the immaterial part of them, the spirit part of them, if you will. In biblical thinking, a human being was material and immaterial. You had to have both of those to have a full person. And so that's what would be different about the Nephilim. That they're, according to all of the Jewish texts, both in terms of the Hebrew Bible, the intertestamental Jewish tradition, all of it, when you killed one of these in battle or something like that, the disembodied spirit of a Nephilim or one of the related giant clans was what we know and what the Gospels know as demons. So they were, again, fallen spirits, internally, if we can use that kind of language. The other way to look at this is to say, well, the language of Genesis 6, 1 through 4, really isn't meant to be sexual, but it sort of telegraphs the idea that you had rival gods, again, in Old Testament parlance, rival gods, also known as the sons of God, or in Enoch's term as the Watchers, do something to enable people, different groups of humans and human couples, to have unusual children that they were deliberately trying to raise up to annihilate the Israelites. And you say, well, where's the precedent for that? Well, if you think of the Abraham and Sarah story, again, this is foundational to Judaism. The Abraham and Sarah story, we're never told that Yahweh, the God of Israel, has a sexual relationship with Sarah and she has a kid. But we are told that God opened her womb somehow and enabled her when she was elderly to have a child. The child was Isaac, and that's where the Israelites come from. So the idea is, well, maybe you had, again, rival gods, rival divine beings,
mm-hmm.
doing this with other couples deliberately in an attempt to create essentially their own populations, their own armies.
A different offspring.
Right, different offspring with the intent of going after the Israelites. So there's actually two ways to read this, and again, still honor what the biblical writers are actually thinking and the way they're writing the story. What's really interesting is this has deep Mesopotamian roots. I mean, if you look at Genesis 6, 1 through 4, it's obviously set in the Babylonian area geographically, and it's really only been since 2010. So this is pretty recent that cuneiform scholars, scholars of cuneiform tablets, have really made a systematic effort to go back into that material and collect information that specifically pertains to these first 4 verses of Genesis 6. And again, what I've done in Reversing Hermon is collect that material, so it's very recent.
And give us a quick highlight of Genesis 6.
The quick overview, and let's just get into the Mesopotamian material, because that's what is less familiar. The Mesopotamians, again, believed that there were certain divine beings, certain deities, that were responsible for making their civilization, Babylon specifically, great, making it all it was. And these are known as the Apkallu. The Apkallu, again, are these great civilizers that were divine beings. They give, divine knowledge, and this is why Babylon is so great. Well, the higher-up gods in Mesopotamia don't really like people. And you've had lots of shows about the flood story from, Babylonian records. This is going to be familiar to your audience. But the higher-up gods don't like humans, and they want to get rid of them in a flood. Well, the Apkallu are appalled by this. It's like, boy, we invested a lot of time in these people. This is terrible. We can't. We got to do something about this. And so, the cuneiform tablets actually tell us things like Before the flood, the Apkallu were divine beings, 100% divine. After the flood, they were, for lack of a better term, hybrids. They are described as being only two-thirds divine. And what happened apparently was that they, cohabited with women. They have children, and it's their children who are, these quasi-divine beings who become the great men after the flood who preserve the divine knowledge of Babylon. Gilgamesh is one of them. Gilgamesh is called Lord of the Apkallu.
Is it just a great story, Michael, or do you think there's some truth and basis behind it?
Yeah, I think with all literature like this, that you're going to have, how can I say this? Some people don't, I think, get offended by the idea of mythic history when we really shouldn't, because what we're dealing with here, at least when we talk about mythic history, what we're dealing with is that there are certain historical events that play out, and those events are filtered theologically. We do this as religious people, even today. Let's say that I went out, I needed a job, and I got a job. I was applying for them. I got went to the interview, got the job, and I say, boy, this is great. God gave me that job. Well, we've put a theological meaning, sort of a theological spin, onto something that really happened. We give God credit, for working in our lives and blessing us. It's sort of the same kind of thing when you get epic literature like this, where something happens and it's interpreted as being, in part, or maybe in substantial part, the result of divine activity intersecting with what happens here, among humans on Earth. So this is a lot, this is really what's going on, in literature like this. They believe in a supernatural worldview. And, again, there's a lot of people today, including myself, are going to believe in a supernatural worldview, that the material world is not all that there is, and that there is this unseen reality that intersects with us, and we have to, give credit to it. We have to, deal with it in some way, try to understand it, parse it. And that's what's going on in ancient texts. So the situation is really not that much different. You have events play out on Earth, and again, you have divine meaning applied to it. And if we believe in the reality of a spiritual world, I think we need to, believe that, hey, there's something to that. There's something to the idea that the unseen world can intersect with our world in a real-time historical way.
Michael, back to the Nephilim once again. What happened to them? Where'd they go?
Yeah, the biblical record has the Nephilim lines, lineages, if you will, eliminated, terminated by the time of David, at least according to the traditional Hebrew text called the Masoretic text of the Old Testament. If you look at some other manuscripts that are behind something called the Septuagint, which is the ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Nephilim lines perhaps lived a few hundred years after David, but all of the textual material has them being eliminated in the Old Testament period. So I'm not one, who, I know lots of people, would think otherwise, but I'm not one who thinks, oh, there's Nephilim here, they're going to come back, or anything like this. If you're going with just the biblical story, again, the biblical framework here, these lines are eliminated. But what's really more serious, and people might be wondering, well, why would you call the book Reversing Hermon? Right. Hermon is about this mountain, the watchers come down, and all this kind of stuff. What needs to be reversed? What's actually more serious than the Nephilim to, again, ancient Israelites and ancient Jews, is that the Watchers, not only responsible for these guys we've been talking about, the Nephilim, and in Mesopotamian stuff, again, giants like Gilgamesh, more serious is the forbidden knowledge that's taught to humans, not because humans aren't supposed to know certain things, but the way the Mesopotamian story goes, the way Enoch's story goes, the way the Old Testament story goes, is that what was taught to humans was taught in such a way that humans would essentially destroy themselves with it and turn to idolatry and just do all sorts of awful things. It would create chaos on Earth, and that is what is actually more serious. And so if you believe this as an ancient Jew, we'll say an ancient Israelite or Jew, you expected the Messiah, whoever that might be, to come and reverse all these things.
And save you.
To be right, to be the one who rolls it all back. And again, what I'm trying to do in the book is not only give people the background material, especially the more recent material that we only really are aware of since 2010, but also to show how that filters into the New Testament, the way the New Testament writers talked about Jesus. Believe it or not, there are things in Jesus' genealogy that are traceable back to Genesis 6. And this problem of, advanced knowledge, esoteric knowledge, forbidden knowledge that humans use to destroy themselves. There are things in Jesus' genealogy that telegraph that this is the guy who's going to reverse all that. There are things about the birth narrative, the Christmas story, if you will, that telegraph the idea, connect Jesus back to the days of Noah, and again, signify that this is the one who's going to reverse all this horrible stuff. You get it in the epistles, the writings of John, the writings of Paul, the book of Revelation, the book, Peter. New Testament writers, again, thought about Messiah as the person, not who would just deal with what happens in the Garden of Eden, the fall, but also the person who would deal with all this horrendous evil, this cataclysmic chaos that goes on in human society and human relationships, that the Messiah would have to reverse that as well.
Michael, since you've been doing the research and the history and all of this, how does Gilgamesh fit into this?
Yeah, Gilgamesh is actually kind of important because he's called Lord of the Apkallu. The cuneiform tablets, again, have him as a giant. I mean, the picture should sound, kind of familiar. Mesopotamian material has, divine beings before the flood. The same guys are only, quasi-divine after the flood. Gilgamesh is one of them. He's also a giant. The Apkallu get punished by the great god Marduk in Babylonian religion. They get sent to the abyss and all this sort of stuff. Gilgamesh is actually named. He actually shows up by name in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's something that scholars refer to as
the entire name,
the Book of the Giants, the whole name. The Book of the Giants from Qumran names Gilgamesh specifically. There's some other giant names as well, but that's the one everybody knows. Now, what that tells us is it tells us that whoever wrote Enoch and the Book of Giants had access to this much older Mesopotamian material and sort of did the math for us. And again, this is material that the New Testament writers were reading. They had access to. It leaks into New Testament thinking. So Gilgamesh actually becomes kind of a real touch point because he shows up by name among the Dead Sea Scrolls.
What revelations do you think you were able to stumble across when you put together the Reversing Hermon?
Well, everything in Reversing Hermon, again, this is, if I could be so bold to say this is what makes what I do a little bit different than what a lot of people do. Again, I'm a scholar by training. I, have my head in peer-reviewed scholarship, basically every day. And every chapter in Reversing Hermon is based on somebody's dissertation, some, peer-reviewed journal articles. I'm not, doing research on the internet. I'm not making stuff up. I don't have to. There's enough information to wade through.
Right.
But I'll give you one example. When it comes to the birth of Jesus, I personally think that the star, that's associated with the Christmas
Star of
story,
Bethlehem, right?
Yeah, Star of Bethlehem. I think that is connected to Revelation 12. It's part of a number of signs that we get the rest of the picture in Revelation 12. I don't. This is the woman, with 12 stars at her head, the sun in her midst, the moon at her feet, all that sort of stuff. I don't think that we can use that as predictive prophecy nowadays, because if you read Revelation 12, it's connected to the first coming, the birth of Jesus, the birth of the Messiah. But anyway, if you plot that out in an astronomy program, you put all the signs in, you come out with a birth date for the Messiah, which is September 11th, 3 BC. Now, I know some listeners are going to get creeped out by September 11th. Yeah, it's interesting for other reasons other than the ones we're thinking of. And others will say, well, that's impossible because didn't Herod, die in 4 BC and whatnot. There's peer-reviewed scholarship that straightens all this out, people can get reversing Hermon to get access to that. But here's the kicker. If you take that date, September 11, 3 BC, that is also Tishri 1 in the Jewish calendar. Jewish tradition had Noah's birthday as Tishri 1. That means that to a first century Jew who was tracking on this, Jesus was the second Noah. Jesus and Noah shared a birthday. If you actually look at the flood narrative, when the flood comes and the waters recede and all that sort of stuff, the waters recede at the same time as the rising of the Pleiades in the seasonal calendar. The Pleiades, of course, are associated with Orion, the giant. There you go with Genesis 6, the giants, and Noah. That's a really quick overview of. There are actually things that connect the birth, the timing of the birth of Jesus with Noah and the flood story and the Nephilim and all that sort of stuff.
Michael, more to talk about in our final hour, along with phone calls next.